Hello. So, welcome back to the second part of the panel on lessons learned through field studies with cats and dogs. I'm going to do a very brief summary on yesterday's session before we dive straight into discussion across the panel and also questions from the audience. Again, even though we'll be structuring our discussions around key themes, don't be shy to ask something which appears to be off topic. All questions are very, very welcome. So here's a reminder of our 6 lovely panelists, which you see here. We have a gang waiting here for the PowerPoint to complete, and then I'll let them sit down. I won't make them stand for the entire session. You will have got to know some of them quite well by now, and you'll see the names on the cards as well. Okay, so just to give us a quick summary of what we went through yesterday. So we had Zooterin in dogs, Gonocon in dogs, Gonocon in cats, PZP in dogs, PZP in deer, horses and burros, marking in dogs, and surgical sterilisation in dogs. And we had a truly international zip around the world yesterday. We had a bit of the Galapagos, Dominican Republic and Hawaii, plenty in the US, Kenya, Romania, Nepal, Hong Kong and America and independent Samoa, and I'm sure I've missed somewhere. So it was a nice whiz around the world yesterday. And what I'd like to do is just remind us of some of the key themes that came up yesterday. One of the first ones was this importance of stakeholder analysis and engagement, so finding and vetting the right partner and then ensuring that stakeholders are actually part of the process from the beginning, from that planning stage, in order to benefit from their knowledge and ongoing support. We heard about the need to have a supportive vet team, providing training in non-surgicals, but also that ongoing supervision by experienced vets. The importance of a full team support and buy-in on the use of non-surgicals rather than a surgery vets versus the non-surgery vets that can potentially split the team. We heard a lot about the importance of the technicians and the handlers, and these are extremely important to the entire process. They're a very visible part of the fieldwork to the public, and we're not talking about just humane handling, but actually positive handling that's both good for dog welfare, but it can also inspire a change in the perception and handling of dogs by the public, and it's a great opportunity to be that change that you want to see, to walk the walk. We heard about the importance of clear protocols on how to apply the non-surgical, but also every other step in the process. Documentation of those protocols is not optional. We do need clear documentation of every part of the protocol. We heard about adverse events and how to cope with those, how they need to be a priority. We heard about technical solutions of monitoring those remotely. We heard about being sent testicles, sent testicles, that's not true, is it? Sent photos of testicles. Quite weird if they actually sent you the testicles. But also that importance of establishing an owner's comfort with bringing up adverse events, so feeling like not feeling shy about reporting when things aren't going the way they think they should. We heard about incidents command centres for adverse events, but also the other things that can and inevitably will go wrong. And we also started to talk about the ethics of engaging in these field trials and the issues of getting informed and freely given consent when you're working across cultures and languages, and when you're using something novel and exciting like a non-surgical. We still need people to think about the risks openly. Okay. So what we're going to do today is go through these 4 questions, these 4 themes. However, as I say, don't feel shy. If you want to ask anything of our panel, they are here to have their brains mined. So we'd like to hear about the framing or pitching of non-surgical fertility control and how you ensured that consent was fully informed and freely given, especially when you're working in different languages and across different cultures. We would like to hear about the challenges and solutions of working across borders, including when you have regulatory approval in the exporting country, but not in the field site country. How do you gain the approvals to work? We'd like to hear about recruiting animals into a study, things that went well and things to avoid, and also a bit more on how you can sustain connection with those treated animals as they dissipate back out into the field, and therefore keep track of adverse events and make sure that they are spotted and acted on. So those are our 4 discussion themes for today. So if we could just switch off the projector, and then I can let the the panelists sit back down and we will start with the first discussion thing. Okay, so that first question for our panel is how did you frame or pitch non-surgical fertility control in your studies, especially when you were considering owner consent for their animal to be part of the study? How did you face the challenges of language barriers and power differentials? How did you cope with the fact that that could imply their consent may not be fully informed or freely given? How did you overcome these various potential barriers?
I will follow you. Okay, I can start with I think my most relevant experience was in Nepal, where I went to work there with a charity that had been there for a number of years and had established a group that is a permanent group. So these are two people from the UK that retired and established a charity that is called Himalayan Animal Rescue Heart a Foundation, and they have a director, a local director, a Nepali director, and a number of vets and veterinary nurses that work with them. So we could count on their help in pre-selecting the dogs that would have been treated, talking to people. Then talking to people again when we went there and we started the project on injecting some dogs with Gonacon and others as controls. And that involved a long time sitting around and listening to a language I didn't understand, but it worked very well. And it worked very well because people there obviously understood to whom they were talking to, and it worked particularly well when lots of things went wrong that were unplanned. So we could re-establish a rapport with the local community, explain what went wrong and why. That was really thanks to the local team and their understanding of the culture and of the way things are done in Nepal.
Thank you.
So, can you hear me okay? All right, so I created language that two-part. First was to inform owners about the study in advance, and the second segment of the language was to get informed consent at the time that we were conducting the trial. And both its language were shared by community members in advance of the study and then again at recruitment. One key thing was that the language that I created was not at all promotional. It was, if anything, cautionary. I made clear that we were trying something out, and there was no guarantee that it would work. Wrote down a few challenges with this to share. First, I wrote the language in English, and it was translated into Ma and Kiswahili. And so I could not verify the accuracy of the translation or what exactly was being said to people. I had very trustworthy people doing the translation, but again, without being a native speaker, I could not guarantee that the language was what I wanted. The second challenge was that we wanted dogs who were stoic, who were non-reactive to humane handling, and that meant selecting dogs who had basically not reacted to receiving rabies vaccine. So selecting these dogs meant asking the owners if we could, if they would be interested in participating in the study, which leads into the third challenge, which is that there are just inevitable power differentials. The vets were highly educated. They came from Nairobi to a very rural community, and they were not part of that community. And there was also a language barrier there, and also I stuck out like a sore thumb. And then the fourth issue is that a lot of dogs were brought to the vaccination campaign by children, and children were really enthusiastic about getting an earring for their dog, but that presented issues with informed consent. So we sought to overcome this, always had somebody from the community with us. As I mentioned, the language that I developed was cautionary. It made no guarantees or promises to people about how the tag would work. And I wanted to, again, avoid unrealistic expectations. And then we did not accept for tagging any dogs brought by children. But still, it's a hard nut to crack. It's hard to resolve.
Thank you, Val. Anyone else on our panel? Yeah, Emma, thank you.
Thanks. So I have a couple of examples. The first one was on Hawaii, and what I did there was we first of all met with a veterinary association. That was the polite and most respectful thing to do, and explain what suturin is and the benefits of suturin, and who they thought out of the dog population would and the community would receive this the best. So we took our cues from the veterinary association. And then we did a training opened up to all vets on Hawaii for free, and invited other vets to come in from the mainland or anywhere in the world actually that wanted to be trained in suturin, and we made a big deal out of it, and we publicized that, and we invited the local newspapers to come, etc. So then we knew that when we went to the community, the veterinarians on Hawaii already had a good understanding of what suturin was and could give a very balanced opinion as to whether the client should go ahead and get this procedure done or not. Then in terms of the actual community itself, we thought very hard about how we could reach out to them. So we used humor. We came up with funny kind of ads, and we put those all across social media. And the local TV picked up on it as well and ran little stories interviewing local vets on Hawaii about what they thought as well. So that really worked quite well. In terms of permission from the actual clients themselves, we have registration sheets, and they actually, as we're talking with them when we're registering them for either surgery or for non-surgical technique, we go over carefully with them what is going to happen. As you probably all know, when you do MASH clinics, people come thinking they're going to get a vaccination, and actually you're there to do a spay neuter or whatever. So we know from our experience that people get excited about a clinic but don't always know exactly what's going to happen to their dog at that clinic. So our registration team has to go over very carefully what's going to happen, and our registration team is always from that community, so everyone knows each other, so they can feel comfortable asking more questions. And so what we found was that we were sort of directed towards the hunting community. So we found a way into the hunting dog community through somebody that was friendly with them, through the Humane Society there. And we were able to then get to that community, and then they brought us in their dogs, and we did suturin on those dogs and did follow-up care with them very, very intensely afterwards to make sure there were no problems or complications. Because as you know, when you're working in communities, if there's one adverse reaction, or even if you're doing spays and there's a dehiss, your entire program is dependent on reputation. Absolutely. So we had to make sure that everything was in place prior to setting all this up. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from our panel? Yes, Stephanie.
So like I said yesterday, a lot of what we do, our team, is wildlife work, and it's a little bit different. Actually, it's a lot different than doing cats and dogs with respect to consent. But people in urban communities, especially with deer, there are ownership issues there too, especially animals that visit a person's property every day. They really feel a sense of really strong connection with those animals, and they really care about what happens to them, even if what you're doing, you believe, is for the greater good. So I'd mentioned stakeholder analysis yesterday, and that's really how we develop our pitch. We don't go in with this idea of how we're going to pitch this to a community, because when we begin the evaluation, we don't know what the problems are. It could be deer vehicle collisions, for instance, with the urban deer. It could be landscape damage. It could be a combination of different things. And so we try to get an idea of who the stakeholders are, what their concerns are, and we develop the pitch based on that. And we, as Val was saying, we try to be cautionary. A lot of what we're doing has never been done before, and it is research, so we really don't know what the outcome may be. We know what we hope for, but we don't exactly know what's going to happen, and so we're very cautionary. We're not promotional. We don't claim that we're going to solve their problem, but we go in working with them in a really integrated and cooperative way. Continuing the education from the beginning, the duration, and the conclusion of the project, really, really key. And then managing expectations, that's the other part of public education. For instance, with our wild horse and our burro and deer projects, when we first treat animals with PZP, most of them are already pregnant. And so when people start seeing animals fawn, that they have an ear tag in their ear and they've been treated, they immediately think it's not working. And so it's really important to get the word out that we expected that. We expected animals to fawn or to foal the first year. But then from that point forward, we're going to be monitoring them closely to see upon further treatment whether or not they foal or not, or they fawn or not.
Really good points. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, we're going to open up to the floor now for questions before we move on to our next question. And I'm going to use that moderator privilege by sneaking one in at the beginning. Can I ask you, Emma, not how they sent you the testicles, how they sent you the photos of the testicles? What was the what was the technical route that you used to get that sharing between you and the community?
So when we were on Oahu, I think we did 68 injections, and they were mostly people coming from the highland areas, from the farm areas, huge big farm guys with their huge big trucks with their huge cages full of huge dogs, and we couldn't really touch them. The techs would have the farmers and the hunters hold the dogs for us, of course, or we'd inject them through the cages that they were in to sedate them. And so I knew that we really had to do very, very careful follow-up, of course. So the way that I handled it, I did all the aftercare instructions because I was a little paranoid and I wanted to make sure everything went well. And so I was talking to the hunters and the farm guys afterwards, and I asked them if they could please send photographs every single day of their dog's testicles, which I thought was completely weird. But they did it anyway because they love their dogs so much, and they prize their animals so much, and so they wanted to make sure everything was going to work out as well. So every day I'm getting photographs on my phone of dogs' testicles from someone saying, what do you think, Doc? I'm not a doctor, but they thought I was. What do you think, Doc? Are my testicles okay? And I would write back, they look fantastic. Well done. And it kind of went on for 2 more weeks after I got home. I was still getting photographs of their dog's testicles, and I'm still sending, they look fantastic, well done. So we had that relationship, and then actually a couple of months later, I called them all again just to see how everything was going. And again, more photographs of testicles. So even though it was over the top, I think it was a really good example to show that how important technology is. And now that most of us have access to smartphones, I think using a smartphone, being able to send a photograph and get it to the veterinarian that did the injection is absolutely critical. We weren't able to do that back in 2010 when we were in the Dominican Republic because the smartphones weren't widely used at that point. Now they are. So I think now technology's caught up with us. It's made it so much safer. So I highly advise anyone that's going to do this to use smartphones and get lots of photographs of testicles. It works.
And which app were you using? Was that WhatsApp or?
No, it was just regular. We were just using
just
texting.
SMS.
And,
just texting.
When we were in the Dominican Republic, we're using WhatsApp. In other countries, it's Kik.
Yeah. Whichever messaging service they use in that country, I guess you adopt that. So in that case, we're going to move on with the next question for our panel, for the panel discussion, and then I'll open up to the floor again. For this second question, we wanted to ask in particular about those studies that used a non-surgical from one country for a study in another country, and what issues did this working across borders bring?
Okay, so I've had experience mainly of using Gonacon in a number of countries and realized very quickly that different countries have very, very different regulations and laws on whether you can import and use, which are sometimes different things, Gonacon or any contraceptive, I assume, that is not registered for that country, which seems to be most of them. So you need to go to the right channel. Going to the right channel means often spending months, sometimes could be up to a year in advance, to obtain all the approval. You need to fill lots of forms. Sometimes it's expensive to fill the forms. I've just learned we are trying to establish to set up a study in Italy on free roaming horses, and I need to fill up forms something like 30 or 40 pages of information about gonocon on horses, pay the Ministry of Health and another ministry, I don't remember which one, for the pleasure of looking at our proposal, and then hopefully they will say yes, and hopefully we can start. Once we start, we have to be very clear about who can inject, where are the responsibilities of different people. I'm not a vet, I'm a biologist, so I have injected lots of animals, but I don't assume I can inject in a different country. So these are some of the examples that I can bring. And even when everything goes well, so we have a study now in Spain that started with the University of Barcelona on wild boar. Everything was going well, we were injecting lots of animals until some ministry or some authority decided that our colleagues in Spain didn't have all the documents they needed. So the study was stopped, and I hope to report in the future that it will continue, because we still don't know where this is going.
Thank you. And is it always the same ministries? Which departments, or does it change
Oh
per
no,
country?
no, it changes. It depends. It also depends on with whom you're working, because in Hong Kong we are working directly with the government. So in a way, it's a bit easier because they are the ones that decide whether a drug can be imported, and because they don't produce many of the drugs, it's normal in Hong Kong to import veterinary drugs, whilst in other countries it's definitely not normal, and you will find a lot of opposition. And you will also have to sit in my case, I have to jump through an ethical committee in my own laboratory, and then another ethical committee in whatever country I'm going to, with lots of pertinent but grilled-in questions.
And that's a nice little primer for one of the sessions that's coming on later, which is about ethical decision-making and ethical review. Emma, did you want to mention anything about Zutrin in different countries, across borders?
Okay. So I wanted to let you know about the Dominican Republic. Like many countries, it's very difficult to get our medicines in, but there is a process, and we follow those processes. And when it came to Zutrin, this was something that they didn't obviously know much about, and so we went to meet with the director of the health department, and he was responsible for distributing the rabies vaccine throughout the country. And he was having a bit of trouble getting it out to all of the dogs. He had teams going out to the beaches in different towns and different places, and so I suggested to him that it might be a good idea if we could bring in Zutrin, then he could help us bring it in, that we could actually do that for him and rabies vaccinate the dogs and also go ahead and do the Zutrin. And he was intrigued by this idea, and after a bunch of meetings he finally said yes, and so helped us be able to bring in Zutrin. But also that kind of opened up another discussion, because they were intrigued by how quickly we could do our surgeries, and so that opened up another discussion about doing the space the way that the high volume, high standard sterilizations are done these days. And so it opened up another line of discussion, and we were actually able then to train his veterinarians in the spay technique that we use, all of us use now. It also opened up discussions about other drugs that we use that they couldn't get in the Dominican Republic at that time, like dextorbator, etc. And so just from talking about Zutrin, we were able to gain their confidence and gain their respect, and then talk about all these other drugs that could certainly improve surgical veterinary medicine that was happening in the Dominican Republic at that time. So actually, by going through certain people, particularly the head of the Department of Health. They then influenced the Department of Agriculture, because of course everybody knows each other, and then we were able to bring in these medicines. And then we connected with the 3 veterinary universities. 2 of them are in Santo Domingo and one of them's up in Santiago, and they all came to our Zutrin training, so we were able to capture everybody at once, which was fantastic. So by going through that process, we were actually able to open up lots more discussions.
Yeah, I just remember something that Emma reminded me. One of the ways that I've often used, and seems to work very well, when I go in a different country, to manage some wildlife, we often have a workshop for all the stakeholders we can think about and invite them all. And generally they come because it's a free meal, it's a free food, so that's a very good way of getting lots of people in a room. And we do present, based on scientific evidence, what we believe, not what we believe, what are the options available to manage wildlife. So we'll say A, B, and C, including culling, including poisoning, as in it has been done already, so do you want to go down this route? And these are the pros and the cons. And then we discuss with people and ask them, based on this consideration or your own beliefs, what do you want to do? Do you want to go this way or that way? And that seems to, generally we do reach a consensus, and that's probably the best way to go about it.
That's great, thank you. Andrew?
I'd just like to comment in sort of broad sweep about the whole issue of ethical review. So HSUS has now established an animal review committee. And the reason we did this was because the BLM wanted us to review a project that we saw as a management project, but it does have research component to it. We had to prove that we had been through ethical review. So we have an institutional official, that's me. We have a vet of record who's a volunteer sort of consultant that works with us. And we have 3 members, one of whom is an individual from the community, and 3 additional members. And so we go through this process. It's not a pro forma process, but it's a little odd because we're not a university. We're not sort of really out there doing research. We're doing projects where we're doing management of particular things. And that's particularly true of most of our dog work. It's done for management reasons, not for research reasons, but we're collecting data at the same time. And I think you've had a challenge in terms of publication because there are publications now that will not accept reports from these projects if they haven't gone through ethical review. So that's one of the reasons why we established our ethical review committee. But I would also express caution, listening to Valerie talk about her experience in Kenya. If you come from out of the country, you're automatically the expert. People view you as being somehow or other, you know, the big boss and everything else, and it's almost impossible under those circumstances to get what you might call informed consent. And frankly, it's impossible to get informed consent in this country because, generally speaking, you give your informed consent when you're semi-sedated and you've got a group of white-coated individuals standing around you waiting for you to give informed consent, which is always a little bit off-putting.
Thank you, Andrew. That's great. And it's straight after lunch we'll be talking about our work on ethical review, and that's a really nice primer for that, because I think it's an area that we're all really starting to bump up against more and more frequently, as many of our field projects do have a research component, and we're trying to capture data and share that. And as soon as you go to a journal and ask to share those results, they will ask you if you've been through ethical review, quite rightly. So do come and have a listen after lunch, as ACC&D have tried to help by pulling together some guidance on how you can prepare and go through ethical review as best you can. Okay. Has anyone got any questions from the floor? Yay! Peter.
I'd like to make a comment on the calcium chloride not being a drug but a chemical. I feel that in order to get in other countries this moving, it's important to have a local champion, somebody that sees the potential of that particular country, and will have to start convincing the veterinary associations or veterinary organization in that particular country that this is a procedure that is acceptable to be used in dogs or cats or however they want to use that. The compounding is complicated in other countries or does not exist, but works in North America where we can utilize that. And so getting the calcium chloride powder into the country is probably the least of our worries. The biggest problem comes on getting consent that this is something that could be used. And I have several examples of where we sent it, where the veterinarian all enthusiastic, and then, for instance, New Zealand said, no, you can't do that unless you tell me which animal you are going to inject. So of the 10,000 animals that she was planning on doing, there was only one she could do. And obviously that's not going to work. So there's a lot of stuff we have to do, which is also why I said, okay, we need more larger field studies in order to be able to convince the veterinary community worldwide that this is an acceptable way of doing things. We have a lot to do still.
So what I'm hearing is you do not underestimate that very first step of establishing partnerships and consent and approval, and then you have the challenge of owner consent, which, as Andrew just described, can be very difficult to do.
I get a lot of responses through LinkedIn from people that they're all very enthusiastic and say this is great, etc. My plan is, now that we have more interest in it and we'll get more published material that we can refer to, and not just coming from me, who is looked upon as a biased individual, we may have some better results in the future to get that promoted elsewhere in the country. Europe is a whole different story because, again, there's possibilities to get it done in Europe too if there is no alternative. Don't know. There's a lot of investigating that needs to be taken place.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on just to the next discussion theme now. I'd like to ask the panel about how did you recruit animals into your study? What were your options? Why did you choose your final recruitment strategy? And would you do it differently another time? Thank you, Amy.
Okay. Just to remind you, our situation was a bit different. It wasn't a true field study. We set up a controlled laboratory hybrid situation, and we ended up recruiting our cats from local animal control agencies and animal shelters, and we wanted to select animals who were not guaranteed adoption at those facilities. So before we even set about that, though, we needed to make sure we would be in compliance with state law, because that's not something you can do everywhere. The pound seizure issue is certainly something to be regarded, and so we consulted with our state veterinarian and got his advice to set up our research facility not just as a USDA facility, but also as a Department of Agriculture licensed animal shelter. And so that was how we were able to work with the local animal control agencies. I think we were fortunate to have established relationships with these groups. Dr. Whedon runs a successful shelter medicine program out of the University of Illinois, and he works with a lot of these shelters already, so we had that relationship and that trust was already there. So when we approached them to do our work, they really did not have any concerns. Also, we were recruiting cats in August in Illinois, and our municipal agencies especially are just overrun at that time. So I mean no disrespect at all when I say it seemed as though some of the shelters were just throwing their cats at us to get them out the door because they saw an opportunity for that cat not to be killed in their shelter. So it was a unique situation for us, but we were grateful for the guidance from the state government so that we knew we would be in compliance, and the shelters were all quite willing. There was one private 501c3 that had us submit an application to their research committee of their board, and we were denied. They did not want any association with research, and so we respectfully moved on, but the municipal shelters had no problem whatsoever.
Thank you. Anyone else want to mention recruitment strategy for studies? Thank you, Gia.
I can mention something quickly. So in wildlife, we have the opposite problem. We have too many offers of animals. And when we published the first paper on wild boar and how well Gonacon had worked on wild boar, we were submerged by queries from around Europe, around the world, on can we use it tomorrow. So I think our main concern is not to select the animals, but select the people we want to work with. which goes back to what I was saying before. You want to work with somebody that you trust, that has established a reputation in the area and in the local geographic area, but also in the field, because otherwise you will find yourself on different tracks. So they will want something very different from what you want. They will want it. Many people want to use contraceptives in an operational way. We want to solve the problem tomorrow, and we are still at the stage where we are using them in a scientific. We are testing them.
Somewhat similarly, in the Kenya ear tagging study, we ultimately tagged a very small number of dogs before I stopped the study, but there was a lot of interest. People were super excited at the possibility of having their dog ear tagged. So the issue with recruitment, from my standpoint, was really to how to turn people away. And I suspect that there could be some corollaries with that, with non-surgical fertility control, where you're selecting certain animals of a certain age, of a certain, certain dispositions, certain, fill in the blank. So in our case, I, as I've mentioned before, I really wanted dogs who were okay to be handled, so that they wouldn't be vocalizing and seriously anxious, and we could be clear on how they responded to the tag versus how they responded to handling. And the idea of turning dogs away in an environment where dogs were already being treated quite roughly at times was concerning to me. I didn't want the animals to be punished for their fear. So one thing that I did was I offered microchips as an alternative to those people. We had a vet who was really skilled at implanting microchips, incredibly humane. So even though it wasn't an option that I felt great about because it wasn't necessary for the dogs, I felt that it was something that I could justify. But that sort of gets to the point, as I mentioned yesterday, the act of excluding people and excluding, more specifically, dogs, did, I think, lead to somebody taking it upon herself to notch the ear of her dog. And we know that it was a dog who was excluded because he had a microchip. So again, I just mentioned that because, I think that, I don't think that sort of unexpected possibilities or remote possibilities, that was something I absolutely did not expect. I don't think that should prevent moving forward with new technologies and new tools and innovation. But it was just a really harsh reminder that we really need to predict the unpredictable when working with people.
Thank you.
Thanks. So what we did on Hawaii was we made the neutering and the zootering the same deal for people, free, and put out a phone number and said that they could call in, and when they called in on this phone number, they were given information about the zootering and they were given information about the neutering. So they could choose what they wanted to do. And we were curious. We didn't know which way this was going to go at all. And it ended up that more people called in to get a zooter than a neuter. At the end of the day, we ended up doing, I think it was 68 zooters and 69 neuters, just because one of the dogs failed the test to get zooted. So that was very interesting. And then from doing that, we did a little survey to find out why people chose one over the other, which has some really interesting results, which I'm very happy to share with everyone. But essentially, it was the hunting community were the ones that basically jumped onto the zooter, and that's what we learned from that. So next time we do it, if we do it again, we would actually go to the hunting community first and try to work in that community, go to them and do it there. So that's what we learned from doing it by putting out a number and saying, everybody call in.
What did the hunting community like about zooter that they didn't like about neuter?
Okay, they didn't want the behaviour to change of their dogs. They liked their dogs' testicles, and they wanted them to remain. And those are the main the main reasons that they wanted to keep their dogs. Because in the hunting community, if the dog, as you probably know, if the dog is not a good hunter, the dog can either be shot, drowned, or taken to the Humane Society, where it's often euthanized. And if there's an excess of puppies, the same thing happens. And so if we were able to go and zooter the dogs that aren't very good at hunting, at least then they had a chance to go to the Humane Society and be adopted out. So it gave them another option as well, because they didn't really want to, go ahead and kill their dogs, but at the same time, they didn't have any other options, they felt.
Thank you. Gia? Yep.
I just thought of something that Valerie reminded me. When we were working in Nepal and some dogs were brought to us, we were wanting only females, and typically lots of males came. The carrot was a rabies injection. So we're saying, if you want, we can give your dog a rabies injection and some vitamin. And that seems to keep people happy. And we explained that we were only wanted females. However, you didn't waste your trip here because we're giving you a rabies injection.
Thank you. Gio, can you tell us any more about how you attracted people to come to that particular study?
It was mainly due to, Hart has worked for a number of years in the area, neutering and spaying animals. And they went around talking to people saying, there is an option, there's another option, it will not involve surgical sterilization. It's a trial, but if you want, your dog could be part of the study. And several people seem to come forward, and they were happy to work with this particular group, and does with me also.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel? Okay. Anyone? Question from the floor. Thank you.
Are you saying that an existing group did the recruitment?
Correct.
Okay.
So an existing group, that's why I thought an existing group on the ground that will stay on the ground later on is essential.
And they were a group that were well known to the community. They'd been active in that location for some time, so there was a level of trust as well with them. Okay, so the next question that I've got for the panel is, how did you sustain connection with those animals that you recruited? I know we've already heard Emma's example of the testicles. How did you deal with adverse events, and would you do it differently another time?
Are you looking at me?
I might be looking at you, Gio.
I don't know, I don't want to repeat something that we mentioned at the ACC&D a few years ago. So I don't know whether I'm going over an old story here, but the work so whatever work I've done in any country, we do make a point of measuring the impact of intervention at a population level, not only at the individual level. Otherwise, there's no point in doing what we do. Yeah, one point could be you educate people, you make people aware of this possibility, but I really want to go further and say, okay, did we make a difference, and how big was the difference? So Nepal in particular was millions of lessons learned. It was a disaster. Disaster was due to the fact that we were all happy about using gonacon to start with. In a study had been carried out in Mexico, where they showed that there was no injection site reaction and the dogs were infertile. So we were all ready, went to Nepal, told everybody, no problem, we do not expect, maybe a bit of limping as any injection, vaccine injected, but apart from that, nothing else. And I think 98% of the dogs developed severe injection site reactions, so open abscesses, which we did not expect. And when we looked into it, the National Wildlife Research Center, that was my partner, made a genuine mistake, and that was the only mistake they did in 14 years. I would like this to be recorded because we have had a fantastic relationship with them. They sent me the vaccine, the gonacon, that they would use on deer, and in that particular formulation, the adjuvant is much higher than the one that the Mexican had used on the dogs, hence the injection site reaction. Now, so we told everybody what had happened. We were very open. Apart from telling the scientific community, we also told the local people. Those dogs had the best veterinary care that they would have had in their lives, because they had 2 vets constantly on them with analgesic, with making sure that all the injection reactions were resolved. No dog died. And yeah, I don't think it's a lesson learned, check what you have been sent, but maybe it is. Maybe you should ask the people that send you vaccine or contraceptive, are you sure? It looks a bit like idiot, but yeah, maybe it's another lesson. But I think thanks to the fact that HEART had been working in there for many, many years and was mainly composed by Nepali people that had gained the trust of local communities, I don't believe that trust was lost. In fact, we're still working. I'm still working with them. They're still working in many areas. So it was seen for what it was, a genuine mistake.
So I think that from my perspective, I guess what I wanted you to talk about was the fact, just as you have done, the fact that you had that group there that had the trust, people were able to come to them, explain there was an adverse event, they were ready to cope with that, so that you were prepared for them when they arrived. So I think that was, for us, a very good lesson for the rest of us.
As I said yesterday, the fact that we had ticked all the bureaucratic boxes didn't make trouble for us with the local animal welfare groups that were not very impressed by what had happened. So I think it was good also to say, yeah, we ticked all the boxes, we did our best, genuine mistakes happen, next time we hope it won't.
Yeah. Anyone else on the panel? Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to make a point about veterinarian support, because that was a bit tricky for us, because we were running ZMESH clinics, so we're doing non-surgical and surgical. And if you heard me speak yesterday, you heard that I explained that many of the surgical veterinarians were opposed to the use of Zutrin in the same clinic, and that caused issues. So I think in the future, we would work with the distributor much more closely to make sure that the veterinarians that have been promoting surgical and are against non-surgical have a chance to work with that distributor so they can get the information and feel comfortable before going out on a MASH clinic or a ZMASH clinic and causing that divide. Because it not only causes a divide in the actual clinic itself, it causes a divide with the community, of course. And everyone's like, well, do we trust them? Don't we trust them? And then that causes so many more problems. So I think from the very beginning, whoever's distributing the next product needs to really work hard to make sure that the veterinarian community is on board as much as possible before we as NGOs go out there and start trying to implement these products in the field as safely as we possibly can.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open up to the audience in a moment. I'm just going to have a moment's moderator's privilege. Stephanie, you mentioned something yesterday that I wanted you to just describe in a little bit more detail, which was the Incident Command Centre. That sounded like a great way to have, a great system to have set up to deal with adverse events. Can you just tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, just a little bit. So this is a system that FEMA uses when they're responding to national disasters, and the HSUS often works with FEMA to help with the animal side of natural disasters. And for one thing, it's really helpful to use their incident command system, because then you're using the same system that they're using. So when you are deployed to work on a natural disaster that involves animals, everybody's working under the same system. And the idea is that everybody has their roles assigned to them. It may be something completely different than what they actually do for the organization in any other situation, and that's probably the most important message to drive home, just because the person that's, for instance, maybe your direct report in any other situation, when you get deployed, you may be reporting to them, because they may be the incident commander, or they may be one of the 4 people that report to the incident commander, and you are simply serving a role under them. And the helpful thing about having really well-established roles is it makes communications very simple. You focus on what you've been assigned to do and not everything that's happening above you and below you. And in situations like that, it's really important for there to be clarity, so you're focused on what your job is.
can I open up to the floor just to see if there's any questions from the audience? Okay, right. Oh, yes, one question. Thank you.
Hi, I was actually just going to go quickly back to the exemption. Thank you for bringing that up. Mind you, this is a model, so every state's going to be different. But the exemption for owners caring for their own animals is subject to the state's animal cruelty laws, and that's why you can't surgically neuter your own dog or inject a chemical with the intention of necrosing tissue without pain medication and things like that. And that would obviously have to, those people would have to follow the regulations and laws that would have to do with those medications or biologics. So just wanted to put that.
That's an excellent clarification. Thank you very much. And I think from an ACC&D perspective, we definitely wouldn't be encouraging owners to try and zooter or use calcium chloride to neuter their dogs themselves. Okay, any other questions? Okay, if not, can you just thank me in joining in sort of thanking this hard-working panel? They spent a lot of time preparing, so thank you very much.